Shabbat Shalom, everyone. You may be seated. This Shabbat, I want to tell you 3 stories about 3 women. The first woman's name is Cecilia Sheehan. And on August 16th, 1987, her life forever changed. She was 4 years young. She was from Phoenix, Arizona, and she was traveling in Detroit with her mother, her father, and her older brother. The flight that she was on, Flight 255, left Detroit Airport at around 8:40 p.m. And it wasn't able to lift at takeoff. It had a problem with its flaps. And about 23 seconds after it took off, it crashed into a fiery ball right outside the Detroit Airport in a city known as Romulus, Michigan. The Romulus Fire Department came immediately, surveyed the wreckage, and were looking for survivors. And one particular firefighter heard a moan under rubble. He thought it was just a toy or some creak of the metal. He moved the rubble, and he was amazed to see a child in a child seat who was clearly alive. He grabbed her. They quickly put her inside an ambulance and treated her at the University of Michigan for her severe wounds from burns. 2 days later, she was identified as Cecilia Sheehan, and she was the lone survivor of that plane crash that killed 156 people that day, including her mother, her father, and her brother. She was later raised by an aunt and uncle in Alabama, and they fiercely protected her identity, knowing that she would already have an incredibly traumatized life. They didn't want her to have to go through more trauma. So the community that had gathered around her, both in Phoenix, where she was from, and in Detroit, where she was the lone survivor, really knew nothing about her for years and years. She, of course, was made aware of the crash. She remembers the crash. She remembers being on the airplane. And as she became an adult, one of the first choices she made was she had a tattoo of an airplane put on her arm. In 2012, she decided to talk about her experience, came out as an adult, decided to tell everyone what it was to be a lone survivor, and she bandied with 13 other people, because there are 14 people in the entire world that are lone survivors of plane crashes. And they have made this small group, and they communicate with each other. They talk about what it is to be that lone survivor. They have a group of other family members from that crash, and Cecilia talks with them regularly. They have a listserv, a WhatsApp group, and she communicates as she feels she has something to add. Her life has obviously forever changed, and she was forever traumatized, but she has gone on with many parts of her life that keep her in the mainstream. She married, began a family, and she always, every day, incorporates the memory of her family and all those on the plane, and she says that not one day has gone by that she doesn't think about that fateful moment. That was on August 16th, 1987. The second woman I want to talk about today, more of you might be familiar with the name. It was in the same year, just a few months later, October of 1987. And at the time, the girl's name was Jessica McClure. She lived in a small town called Midland, Texas. And she was at her aunt's daycare center, where Jessica was all of about 20 months, just a toddler, walking and playing in the backyard. And as she was playing during break time in this nursery school, Jessica fell down a well. Now, when I say the word well, a lot of you probably think of these brick-like structures 3 feet off the ground with these cranks for water. That is not what I am referring to at all. The well was about 6 inches in diameter. It was in the ground. It was metal. And somehow or another, she stepped both feet into that well. Gravity took over, and she went down 40 to 70 feet. And it is a miracle that someone even saw it, yet alone where she disappeared to. People heard her singing. They trickled down water to her. Obviously, they didn't want to drown her by putting too much water down. And engineers flooded the scene, and they decided the best way to reach Jessica was to dig a parallel well and cross over. Jessica was in that well for 58 hours. 58 hours. And miraculously, after multiple attempts, one paramedic went down, bandaged her, worked with her, used a lot of petroleum jelly to release her from the trap she was in. Her leg was pinned against her head. They sang with her songs. And I still remember sitting with my mother and my father, watching the television, when that crane and all of the machinery came up, and then there was the EMT with the hard hat, and in his arms, on that little black backboard, was baby Jessica McClure. She had come out, and it was as if the entire nation had galvanized around this moment. We were all crying. I remember my mother's tears. She didn't know this little girl. She didn't know this family. But there wasn't a dry eye in America that night because we all had gathered around this miracle baby. She was referred to as a miracle baby. She has no recollection of that day or the event, but she has scars still, including on her forehead and her leg. She had 15 surgeries from that event. 15 surgeries. And while she has no recollection of the event, it traumatized those in her family. Her parents divorced 3 years later because of all of the fanfare and recognition that they had wherever they went. A lot of money had poured in to help Jessica with her college education, and some things had happened to that money, and there was fighting over the money. And the EMT, who had gone down and saved Jessica, was so traumatized by the experience of saving her and the role he had and the recognition he got, that a few years later, he died by suicide from that very event. So while Jessica didn't know about it, the family and the orbit sure did. And here's the third story. It's a name none of you will recognize. Her name is Hodiah. I don't know her last name. I met her this summer in Israel on a bus to the central train station. Dory and I got on the bus. We were taking the train to Tel Aviv on a particular Sunday, I think it was. It's irrelevant. And Dory noticed a bag that no one was sitting next to, which is called a chafetz chashud in Israel, a suspicious article. So Dory said, loudly on the bus, "Whose is this?" Because she was scared. She doesn't want to have a suspicious article. And this woman, who later became identified as Hodiah, says, "It's mine, don't worry." And then she looked at Dory and she said, "Don't worry, our enemies no longer hide by putting bombs on buses. They bomb us right to our face and they punch us right in the nose. They don't hide anymore." She said that in almost an angered tone. And then we struck up a conversation, and for some reason or another, it became a very long ride to the train station. And I said to her, "Look, I've been to Israel more times than I can count, literally over triple digits. I've lived in Israel for many years of my life. I've been to Israel many, many times at many different junctures. But when I went this summer, I had never seen Israel the way that I had. Now, I had come shortly after the Iran war, which was 12 days of miracle, 12 days of unfettered access to Tehran and its nuclear weaponry, not one lost airplane, not one lost soldier, not one lost airman. It was an amazing feat that most of the military leaders of the world said dwarfed the miracles of the Six-Day War. And it lasted 12 days, and America joined in. And at worst, we set back their nuclear program. At best, we annihilated it. I thought the country would be exuberant, jubilant, relaxed, excited. That is not how the country was, and this was embodied most by Hodiah. The country was despondent. The country was sad. Everyone around was mournful. Walking down the street and seeing people sitting on a bus stop or a bench at a park, yes, they were doing the things that people do in life, but no one was excited and happy. And I saw this in every conversation I was having, and it traumatized me. So I said to Hodiah shortly after she identified herself as the owner of this bag, and I could see this sense of sourness and upsetness in her voice. "Hodiah, what's with all the Israeli people? What is with the sadness, the bitterness, the anger?" And she said something to me that landed in a way that it kind of crystallized everything that had happened. She said, "We're angry and we're traumatized." I said, "I know you're angry and I understand the trauma, but I've been to Israel at least 11 times since October 7th, and I've never seen this kind of reaction before." And she said to me, she's interesting because I think she was a psychology student. She said, "You see, we had October 7th, and then we had the war immediately afterwards. And then we had everything else you can imagine, which was engagement with Hezbollah, bombing displaced people, taking out of Nasrallah, the whole beeper incident, all of these other pieces that happened with other proxies, bombing the Houthis, which was the furthest bombing campaign we had ever done, further than Iraq and Osric. All of these different pieces and the regular running to the shelters. And when Tehran finally happened, this existential threat for 20 years, and we pushed it back and took away the ticking time bomb of Tehran, you would think that we would all exhale as Israelis, but we didn't. What happened was when we took out the reactors in Iran, it unleashed throughout the people of Israel the PTSD. The post-traumatic stress disorder, which, by the way, was a phenomenon, a disorder that was coined and understood and unpacked by a leading Jewish psychiatrist by the name of Mortimer Ostow. He worked with Lucy Davidovich, who was the great historian of World War II and the Holocaust, and he dealt with PTSD from survivors. And what Hodiah had explained to us on the bus is that this was the first moment in all of the things going on over the course of almost 2 years that the valve could be released for the people of Israel to process the trauma that they had gone through. And at this time, mind you, there were still 52 hostages being held. There was still a war happening every day in Gaza, and sadly, there were soldiers who were coming back not on their own 2 feet. They were being buried. The country was still in the mournfulness. But after staving off 20 months of this unbelievable turmoil without a real moment to stop and to process, the PTSD had hit the country. And when Hodiah had shared this analysis, it resonated with me. And as I started to talk to more people during my time there this summer, I realized that she was spot on. That is exactly what was happening. That there was, yes, a relief in the bombing of Iran, not a joy, a relief. It's a big difference. And then the moment of decompression. What did we just go through? One time, Dory and Elias and I were driving to go visit Dory's sister in Boston, and it was really rainy. Dory enjoys driving in the rain. I don't, so she was driving the car, and right in front of us, we saw 3 cars spin out. A truck hit them. It flew over. It flipped, and it was really scary for us. We immediately pulled over. My son Elias is trained as a paramedic, so we rushed out of the car, and we ran to go see the other people. And all of them walked out of the car. They unbuckled their seatbelts and they walked out of the car. They were fine. They were a little shaken up, as you can imagine. They were fine. And one woman was trying to get in touch with her husband and her phone wasn't working, so we used our phone and we sat with her and she went into our car and we called her and she called her husband and we talked to him and said she's fine, and he came to the place. And the woman called us 3 days later to thank us. And I said, "How are you doing? Do you have any bruises? Is anything hurt?" She goes, "Nothing in my physical body is hurt. But I'm just starting to come to grips with what happened to me. That if that truck would have hit me and just a few feet over, or I would have responded by turning the car left instead of right, or I would have turned into the right median instead of the left median, I could have gone, and that would have been the end of me." And it took her 3 days to start to begin that process of the trauma that she had been through. I imagine it's not hard for most of you to stretch in your mind where I'm going today. This has been a euphoric week for the Jewish people and for the lovers of Zion. It has been a week, frankly, that I and so many other people I know never imagined. As I heard Nadav Ayal say, he was afraid to dream of this week. And that made sense to me. Never did I think, in speaking to political and military leaders, that they would release all the hostages, their main leverage. And they did. 20 of them came home into the embrace of their families. And there are no words. I don't care what kind of poet can put them together. There are no words to speak about what that embrace felt like. And as you can imagine, those 20 people, they're going to have a long journey of PTSD, of post-traumatic stress disorder. They're going to have a long journey of working through all that they had been through in those tunnels and that torture by that barbaric regime. I'm not as focused on the PTSD of those 20. Of course I am individually, and I'm sure they will get the support they need. But what I'm really focused on right now is while the country is indeed euphoric, and thousands upon thousands of people gathered at what was formerly known as Hostage Square and now known as Freedom Square in Tel Aviv to watch the release of these people in Israel. And the country took a collective exhale. And so many said, for the first time in 2 years, almost to the date, we can breathe. What I am worried about is not if, but when the collective PTSD of this moment, of the trauma of the country of Israel, will begin to hit and will begin to process. Shortly after October 7th, Temple Emanu-El said, we need to raise funds for Israel. And thank God, many communities, JCCs and synagogues of all stripes, did very similar endeavors. We did one thing that was a little different here that I'm incredibly proud of. Of the $1.5 million we raised, we earmarked almost every nickel of that for PTSD. So that families and communities that were dealing with any form of trauma, whether trauma because they were soldiers, trauma because they were relatives of people who died, trauma because they were survived being hostages, or trauma because you live in a country, and as Tal Becker says, it's an incredibly small country, but a very big family. And you were feeling that sense of trauma, we gave to different agencies that support them. And while we indeed can have a collective exhale, and we indeed should be incredibly grateful to this administration to making this miracle happen, and to all of the powers that be that brought them home, we have to remember two important things. There are still too many bodies that need to come back and be buried so their families can have the grace and dignity of having a final resting place for them. And secondly, equally important, we have to provide the emotional, spiritual, and supportive bandwidth for every Israeli and lover of Zion to have that space to deal with the trauma that they collectively went through. If you lived in Manhattan on September 11th, but you worked uptown like I did, you had some trauma in your life. If you, on September 11th, were on an airplane that morning that took off from New York like I did, you have some trauma in your life. It's not the same level as those that had escaped the fiery building, and not the same as those that lost a relative, and not the same as those that missed work that day or those that got to work early. But there are still levels of trauma that people deal with and have gone through as a result of this. We have unpacked the story of Breshit from every level and angle one can imagine. But one piece that's never been unpacked that I have laid eyes on is the trauma that Adam and Eve have to deal with in being banished from the Garden of Eden, from being duped by the serpent into eating the fruit that they knew they shouldn't eat from. But he was so cunning and conniving and forced her to. And the banishment was more than just being kicked out of the Garden of Eden. It, of course, meant that Adam and Eve would know the difference between good and evil. They would know pain. She would know pain in childbirth. And that trauma could be inherited. Because when Cain and Abel were born, we see that shortly after, they fought, and one brother killed the next, and their love was in question. For any of us to think that this trauma will pass for the state of Israel just because they were all released is short-sighted and naive. Yes, it is a time for us to celebrate. Yes, it is a new beginning for them. And as Sydney said beautifully, it's so refreshing to know this is the first Shabbat of the new year and the first Shabbat that all those hostages are back home with their families. And that should give us reason to pause and to say, Hodu l'Adonai ki tov, ki le'olam chasto. God is good, God is great. But let us not take our eyes off the ball of tomorrow and the next day. And the emotional support that will be necessary from all of us in the diaspora and in Israel for our brothers and sisters as they begin this journey back into some sense of normalcy or a new normal and the trauma that they have gone through. Let us be that support. Let us be that compass. Let us be that rock. And while I know that we too, as Jews, have gone through a level of trauma as well, let that return back to us just the same. And may it allow us to grow, to learn, and to increase our ability for empathy and compassion so that when we remember the names of Cecilia Sheehan, or Jessica McClure, or Hodiah on the bus, we are reminded of not only the heroic nature of their survival, but also the journey that they have gone on, and all of those people that made it all the more possible and bearable along the way. Shabbat Shalom, everyone.